I've long been an admirer of George Will. I'm old enough to remember when his column appeared every other week as the back last page of Newsweek magazine. I also remember when he was sort of in the chair of conservative thought on David Brinkley's Sunday morning talk show. Will has a very elegant literary style, and I loved his sort of clip, smart manner of speaking, especially when he was in a kind of lawyerly way dissecting the thought of his intellectual and political opponents. In fact, when I was a professor at Mundelein Seminary years ago, I taught a course in political philosophy. And to get across the idea that was common in the ancients, that the purpose of government was to shape us morally, I had the students read Will's little book called Statecraft as Soulcraft. So I've been using his work and studying him and reading him for a long time. And so with great interest, I turned to his latest book, which by any measure is his magnum opus. It's a big, thick book, and in size and scope, it's a major work called The Conservative Sensibility. And I read it again with great interest, and it has all of Will's typical, virtues and in terms of style and literary impressiveness and all that. The central argument of the book is one that I think is very important and one that I find myself in strong agreement with, namely this, that the American experiment in democracy is grounded in this epistemological conviction that political rights are not the gift of government, but political rights are grounded in at least relatively stable human nature, which is a given prior to government. Government exists, and here we go back to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Government exists to guarantee, and to use the word now that Will thinks is the most important word in the prologue, to secure these rights. In other words, government is the servant of these rights, not the creator of them. As that move is extremely important and is ratified, certainly by Catholic social teaching, that government is not the grantor of rights, but the protector of rights. This is the source of a healthy sense of limited government. This goes a long way to keeping tyranny at bay. In a way, see, Will is following John Locke, as Jefferson followed Locke, that the purpose of government is to guarantee an arena in which the freedom of individuals can express itself. They can pursue happiness as they see fit. Now, a lot of the first half of the book, in light of this principle, is a critique of progressivism. And Will traces this back to the philosophical thought of Hegel, because of course Hegel had called into question the permanence of human nature. Nature is a much more historically conditioned, malleable reality, and therefore this opened the door, Will thinks, to government playing the role of shaping human nature according to its purposes. So he sees Hegel's philosophy as incarnating itself in the practical politics of Theodore Roosevelt, whom he calls beautifully Hegel on horseback, and then especially in Roosevelt's second successor, Woodrow Wilson. He sees these two players as the fathers of modern political progressivism, and coming up through Franklin Roosevelt into Lyndon Johnson. And he thinks really all of our political sensibility today. The problem is all this has conduced toward what many complain about today, which is the hyper-intrusive sort of nanny state that presides over all aspects of life and tries to shape us according to its sense of the good. That sense of the good, by the way, always evolving. This is what Will is opposed to, what he names as progressivism, and he sees it as undermining the purposes of the founders. Okay. So far in the book, I found myself often applauding and in agreement. As I say, Catholic social teaching is a fan of limited government, likes the fact that a stable human nature and political rights precede the moves and policies of government. It's also suspicious, it seems to me, of a progressivism grounded in a sort of Hegelian or neo-Gnostic sense of the malleability of nature. With all that, I find myself in profound agreement. I must say, though, as the book unfolded, I became less and less enthusiastic about it. Now, here's why. Having said all that, so having affirmed all that's really valuable in that kind of Lockean, Jeffersonian tradition, Catholic social teaching is at the same time wary of a public space that is basically morally thin. Now think of this for a second. Hobbes and Locke, the two great figures behind the founders, and then Jefferson himself, all clearly thought that no clear objective sense of the morally good can be discerned, no common sense of the shared good can be agreed upon. Therefore, what's best is to allow for this arena of freedom in which all the individuals seek what they perceive to be their own good. The government's role is to guarantee that space and to police that space so that as we seek our own private goods, we don't bump too much into each other, right? So to protect and to secure the rights of life, liberty, and mind you, the pursuit of happiness, says Jefferson. Because we don't really know what happiness is, so let each individual pursue it according to his or her own lights. Government's job is to keep that space open and to keep it relatively safe. Now, Catholic social teaching, it seems to me, is uneasy with how thinly described this space becomes. If that's the whole purpose, just to maintain basic life freedom so that we can pursue our ends as we see fit, what's fallen apart? What's fallen apart is a common moral purpose to the society, a real sense of the common good, or the commonweal, they used to say, the commonwealth. What's the shared moral purpose of a society? Catholic social teaching says this, and I think Will would be uneasy with it. To some degree, government does help to determine this. Now, how? Through legislation, it protects indeed. So part of law's purpose is to protect. I would say, for example, the fact that laws prohibiting abortion have fallen apart. That's a huge moral problem because now we don't have a protection. Or that laws protecting against euthanasia are being more and more compromised. That's a real problem because law is meant to protect certain basic moral goods. But more to it, Cardinal George has always insisted upon this. Law also teaches us what to desire and what not to desire. Because what's legal and what's illegal inform us to a degree about what we ought to be seeking and ought to be avoiding. So partially government's role through legislation is to help determine the moral purpose of a society. Now, more to it and more importantly, all those mediating institutions that stand between government and the individual, I'm talking about social organizations and clubs and societies and Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts and Rotary clubs and above all, religion. All these mediating institutions make the public space morally thick, if I can put it that way. So that's not the nanny state we're talking about, but it's a morally coherent public space. Catholic social teaching likes limited government, but it also likes a public space that is not denuded of spiritual and moral purpose. Now, take one more step, and this is where, again, I was uneasy with Will's argument. He makes it explicitly clear at the end of the book that he's operating out of an atheist perspective. He himself is an atheist. He says, not an aggressive one. He's not on a campaign against religion. But he doesn't think we need God to ground this political project. See, and there I would strongly disagree, as does Catholic social teaching. When you take God out of the equation, what happens? First of all, inevitably you move into a Hobbesian metaphysic. And again, what I mean here, Thomas Hobbes' view that the world is just made up of matter and motion, of atoms moving about and colliding into each other. He read that metaphysically and he read it politically. The political science is the result of looking at the world as just a space where individuals are seeking their own private ends. See, when the unifying element, which is the Creator God, that through whom all things are united to each other, when that's taken away, the Hobbesian metaphysic takes over, it seems to me. And you have the public space described by George Will, and by Thomas Jefferson, to be fair, of individuals seeking their private ends. More importantly, you take God out of the equation, you finally take away the ground for objective morality. Now, I know this is a big argument, and this could be a whole semester course, but the conviction of Catholic social teaching is that finally, without God, any objective claim to moral value evanesces. And you do indeed find this constantly changeable moral space. What was morally right yesterday is no longer morally right. It depends on the individual. It's all relative to your social status, et cetera, et cetera. And when that happens, the morally thick public space is compromised. So what would I say in conclusion? There's a central argument of the book with which I strongly agree. That first argument he makes, I think, is a very important one. And Catholic social teaching affirms it. But as the argument unfolds, much less enthusiastic, because we can't just have this thin Lockean, Jeffersonian public space. There's more to it than that. So I guess I'd say in the end, maybe, one cheer for the conservative sensibility.